The alien queen asked, who guarded her daughter. Every soldier pointed at the same human. The alarm was already screaming when I reached the corridor. Not a drill. I could tell the difference by now. Drills had a certain laziness to them, a half-second delay before the alien officers moved, the way their secondary eyelids would flicker with boredom rather than snap shut with focus. This was not that. This was every light on the station shifting to deep amber, every ventilation fan dropping to a low hum, and 40 beings from 12 different species scrambling for positions they had not trained for nearly enough. I had been on Station 14 for 11 days when it happened. I was carrying 2 cups of coffee, one for me, one out of habit, because I had not yet broken the practice of making a second cup, even when there was no one left to give it to. The cups were still in my hands when the first explosion shook the far end of Corridor 7. I set them down on a supply ledge very carefully, because spilling coffee felt like an undignified way to begin whatever this was going to be. My name is Callum Reeves. Most people call me Cal. I am 34 years old, a sergeant in the Coalition Protection Detail, and I had been assigned to Station 14, specifically because no one else wanted to be here. That is not bitterness. That is just the shape of the truth. Station 14 orbited the third moon of a gas giant called Vara 3 Sol, which is a name that takes practice to say without sounding like you are clearing your throat. The station itself was an old thing, built in 3 phases by 3 different civilizations, and you could tell which section came from which era by the ceiling height and the smell. The oldest section smelled like copper and something floral I never identified. The middle section smelled like nothing, which is its own kind of statement. The newest section, where humans had contributed the final 2 modules, smelled like recycled air and instant noodles, and someone's ongoing argument with the ventilation settings. I had arrived on a transport shuttle that was running 4 hours late, carrying a bag with 2 changes of clothes, one very battered novel I had read 6 times, and a service record that was technically clean but personally complicated. The officer who processed my assignment paperwork was a tall Vethari named Kolath, who had 4 arms and the expression of someone doing a difficult calculation. He looked at my file, then at me, then back at the file. "You are the 4th human to take this posting," he said. His translator unit clipped the words a little short, the way all the older models did. "I know," I said. "The previous 3, each lasted less than 30 days. I know that too." He studied me for another moment. "The princess does not respond well to new personnel. She has been through significant trauma. She requires patience and consistency. Are you a patient individual, Sergeant Reeves?" I thought about the honest answer, which was that I was not naturally patient, that patience was something I had learned the hard way after losing someone I should have protected, but that answer was longer than the moment required. "I can be," I said. Kalath handed me my access credentials without any further warmth and pointed me toward the residential wing. The Princess Sira was 17 years old. She was the youngest of the Vetharai Queen's 3 children, and the only one who had been present during the attack on the Royal Transit vessel 14 months ago. I was not briefed on the full details of that attack. The Coalition kept the specifics classified, but I knew enough. I knew that 3 of her personal guards had been killed. I knew she had spent 11 weeks in a medical recovery unit afterward. I knew that since then, she had been relocated 6 times, assigned 9 different protection details, and that not one of those details had lasted longer than 5 weeks. Some left because the assignment was considered career-limiting. Some left because the princess herself asked for them to be replaced. Some left for reasons that were listed in the file simply as incompatibility. I was the replacement for a Vethari officer named Durath, who had filed a formal request for reassignment after 2 weeks on the basis that the princess's behavior was unmanageable. The file included his written statement, which described Sehra as uncooperative, non-communicative, and hostile to standard security protocols. I read that 3 times on the shuttle ride over, and each time it told me less about Sehra and more about Durath. A 17-year-old who had watched her guards die and had been moved 6 times in 14 months was not being difficult. She was being sensible. My first day on the assignment, I introduced myself through the speaker panel outside her chamber door, stated my name and rank, said I would be outside the door if she needed anything, and then went and sat down in the corridor with my book. She did not open the door. I read 40 pages and then went to get dinner. The second day I did the same thing. Introduction, book, dinner. The third day, I brought a second chair and set it in the corridor. Not in front of her door, just nearby. I did not explain why. I sat in one chair and left the other empty and read my book. On the fourth day, the door opened 6 centimeters, and I heard very quiet breathing, and I kept reading and did not look up. On the 7th day, she spoke. "What are you reading?" I held up the cover so she could see it through the gap. It was a novel about a man who walked across a continent alone to deliver a letter. The plot is less interesting than it sounds when I describe it that way, but it is the kind of book that makes you feel like the world is very large and also very survivable. "Is it good?" she asked. "It is the 6th time I am reading it," I said. "So yes." The door opened a little more, not all the way, just enough that I could see one of her eyes, which were the deep amber color that most Vethari had, with that secondary reflective layer that caught light in a way that always looked slightly luminescent. She studied me for a moment. "You brought a second chair," she said. "I did." "Why?" "I thought someone might want to sit in it." She said nothing else. The door closed again, but she had spoken, and that was more than Darath had managed in 2 weeks. I kept showing up every morning, every shift, every quiet hour in between. I brought the chair. I brought the book. Sometimes I brought a second cup of something hot from the station kitchen, though I never offered it directly, just set it near the second chair and let her decide. The other guards on the station watched me with a mixture of amusement and mild professional concern. They were polite about it. The Vethari military had rigid codes of courtesy, but I could hear the conversations they thought were too quiet to carry down the corridor. "The human is still here," one of them said to another on the 9th day. I was around the corner at the water station when I heard it. "Durath said he would last a week," the other replied. Durath also said the princess would never speak to another guard. A short pause. "How long do you think he stays?" 2 weeks. Maybe 3. He will find the silence too heavy." I filled my cup, walked back to my chair, and opened my book to page 147. I did not say anything. I did not need to. I had learned a long time ago that proving people wrong does not require an announcement. You just have to still be there when they stop watching. On the 11th day, the alarm went off. I set down my coffee cups and moved toward Corridor 7, not because I had been given orders to, but because that was where the sound had come from. The explosion had left a dark scar along the upper wall, and the lighting was flickering in the way that meant the secondary power conduit had taken a hit. 2 alien officers from the station's standard security rotation were at the far end, weapons up, facing a sealed door. A third officer ran past me in the opposite direction. "What happened?" I asked. "Unknown breach in docking sleeve 2, he said without stopping. "Automated protocol. Non-essential personnel should return to quarters." I was not, technically, non-essential personnel, but I was also not part of the station's general security rotation. My assignment was one person. I looked at the flickering lights and the scar on the wall, and the 2 officers standing very still and very far from where I needed to be. I turned and walked back toward the residential wing. Not running. Running draws attention, and attention in a breach situation is a resource you spend carefully. Sephir's door was still closed. I knocked 3 times in the pattern I had established. 2 quick, 1 slow, which was different from the station's emergency knock protocol, which was 4 rapid. She would know it was me. "Sergeant Reeves?" Her voice was tight but controlled. "Yes," I said. "There is an incident in docking sleeve 2. I am going to need you to move to the secondary room, the one without windows." Thammer pause. "Is it bad?" "I do not know yet, which is why we are moving now, while I still have choices, instead of later when I might not." The door opened. She was dressed, which was either luck or instinct, or the habit of someone who had been through this before, and learned not to be caught unprepared. She looked at my face with those luminescent amber eyes, and I kept my expression steady, because fear from a guard is not reassuring, it is contagious. "The secondary room," I said. "Now." She moved. I followed her down the corridor, placed her in the room, checked the lock on the interior panel, and stood with my back against the door facing outward into the dark. The station's amber lights pulsed around us. Somewhere in docking sleeve 2, something was not yet finished, and I had the very specific, bone-deep feeling of a man who has learned to trust that feeling, the feeling that this night was only getting started. The secondary room was small and had no windows, and smelled like the copper and floral scent of the oldest section of the station, which meant the walls in here went back further than anyone currently living had been alive to see built. There was one light panel in the ceiling, a storage rack along one wall, and a bench that was designed for a Vethari body, and therefore slightly too long and slightly too narrow to be comfortable for either of us in different ways. Sahira sat on the bench. I stood at the door. I could hear, faintly through the corridor, the sound of boots on metal flooring, multiple sets, moving with purpose. Some of them were the measured, synchronized tread of the station's security team. Some of them were not. "How many people are with you normally?" Sarah asked. Her voice was quiet but not shaking. "On this rotation, just me. The others had teams. Durath had 4. Durath also asked for a team transfer after 2 weeks," I said. I kept my eyes on the door panel and my ears on the sounds beyond it. More bodies in a corridor is not always more protection. Sometimes it is just more confusion. She was quiet for a moment. Then, "You were military before this?" "Still am. Coalition Protection Detail is a military posting. I mean, before the Coalition. Earth military." "Yes. For how long?" 8 years, I said. Before that, I was 19, and working in a warehouse moving boxes, which was honest work, but not particularly stimulating. I heard her almost laugh. Not quite. Just the small adjustment of breath that precedes one. The sounds in the corridor shifted. The synchronized boots had stopped. The other set kept moving. I reached for my sidearm without drama, unclipped the safety with my thumb, and kept it pointed at the floor. If she saw, she did not say anything. "Sergeant Reeves," she said. "Cal," I said. "You can call me Cal. Most people do. Cal." She said it carefully, like she was testing the shape of it. "Have you done this before? Protected someone?" I thought about the honest answer again, and again decided on a shorter version. "Yes," I said. "I have. Did it go well?" 3 seconds of silence. "Not always," I said. I heard her shift on the bench. I heard the sound in the corridor change again. The other boots had stopped now too. Wherever they were, they had reached wherever they were going. "What happened?" she asked, "when it did not go well?" I was not going to answer that question while standing at a door in an amber-lit corridor during an active breach. Some conversations need the right kind of stillness, and this was not it. I filed the question away for later. "Later," I said. "When this is over." Another near laugh. "You are very calm for someone who does not know what is on the other side of that door." "I know some things," I said. "I know there are 2 of them, not 1. You can hear the difference in how the footsteps pattern. I know they came in through the docking sleeve, which means they had transit credentials, or they bypassed the scan, and bypassing a scan takes planning, not impulse. I know they passed 3 closer targets on the way here, which means they are not opportunistic. They know where they are going." Silence from the bench. "That is not actually calming," she said. "I know, but it is useful." I glanced at her briefly over my shoulder. Knowing the shape of a problem is better than not knowing, even when the shape is unpleasant. I turned back to the door, and I turned back to the door. The next 4 minutes were very quiet, and then the door at the end of the corridor opened. 2 figures. They were wearing the uniform of station maintenance workers, which was either a genuine cover or a very obvious one, depending on how much confidence they had in the station's security response time. From what I had seen of the station's security response, I suspected they had done their research. I am not going to describe what happened in precise detail, not because I am being modest, but because close-range engagement in a narrow corridor is less like the action sequences in films, and more like solving a very urgent, very physical problem under significant time pressure. There is very little that is elegant about it. You move, you respond, you adapt, and at the end of it, either the problem is solved or it is not. The problem was solved. I will say that I used the door frame more than my sidearm. and that the second figure took longer than the first, and that somewhere in the middle of it, I collected a graze along my left forearm that I did not notice until the corridor was quiet, and I was standing in it, and my sleeve had gone dark with something that was warm and already cooling. I went back to the secondary room door and knocked twice quick, once slow. A pause, longer than I expected. Then the door opened. Sephra looked at my sleeve, then at my face. "You came back," she said. It was not a sentence that should have carried much weight. It was a short sentence, a simple sentence, but it came out of her like something she had been holding for a very long time, and it had a lot of weight in it, and I understood immediately that she was not just talking about tonight. "That is the job," I said. She stared at me for another moment, then she stepped back and let me check the corridor behind me, and I did, and we waited for the station security team to arrive, which they did, 11 minutes later, organized and thorough, and almost entirely too late to matter. Kalath arrived 20 minutes after that, with 2 other officers and a medical technician who cleaned the graze on my arm with something that smelled like antiseptic and faint mint. He looked at the 2 figures in the corridor, now restrained and being processed, and then he looked at me with the expression of someone doing that difficult calculation again. "You engaged them alone," he said. "They came to the corridor," I said, "so yes. You did not wait for security response. The response time is 11 minutes, I said. A lot can happen in 11 minutes. Protocol requires me to protect the princess, I said. I protected the princess. If there is a conflict between the method and the outcome, I am happy to discuss it when the princess is safe in a more secure location, and I have had some sleep." Kalath was quiet for a moment. He had 4 arms, and he had them arranged in a pattern that his species used for either deep thought or controlled frustration. I had not yet learned to tell the difference. "The princess will be moved to the upper residential block," he said. "It is more defensible. You will accompany her." "Of course," I said. They moved Seka. That same night, the new room was larger, 2 levels up, with a heavy door and a secondary lock panel, and 2 windows that looked out at the gas giant Varith Sol, hanging enormous and amber-orange in the dark. It was, by any measure, a better room than the one she had before. She stood at the window for a long time before she slept. I was outside in the corridor, chair in its usual position, book on my knee, when she opened the door at roughly the 3rd hour of the night cycle and stood in the doorframe. "You should sleep," I said, without looking up. "So should you." "I will, when the shift changes at hour 5. She stood there for another moment. I heard her look at the second chair. I kept reading. "You said later," she said, "about what happened when it did not go well." I set the book down. I thought for a moment, and then, because she had asked honestly, and I thought she had earned an honest answer, I told her, not everything. There are things that are mine alone to carry, but enough. I told her about a man named Len, who had been my partner on a protection detail on Earth 3 years ago. I told her about the night that went wrong, not because of incompetence, but because of one piece of information that nobody had told us. One door we had not known about. One variable that had not been in the briefing. I told her that Len had been between that door and the person we were protecting, and that by the time I reached him, the door was already closed. I did not tell her I had replayed that night, approximately 10,000 times in the 3 years since. I did not need to. She was smart enough to hear it in the spaces between the words. "Is that why you are here?" she said. "On this assignment?" "Because of him." "Partly," I said. "Because you wanted to do it again, protect someone." I looked up at the corridor ceiling. It was old metal, the Vethari kind, with that faint, luminescent threading they used in their earlier construction. Functional, not decorative, designed to glow softly in darkness so that no corridor was ever truly pitch black. Someone had thought about that. Someone, hundreds of years ago, had decided that no one should ever have to move through complete darkness, and had built that decision into the walls themselves. I found that quietly remarkable. "I wanted to do it right," I said. "There is a difference." She considered this. I could not see her face from where I was sitting. She was leaning against the doorframe, and my chair was angled toward the far end of the corridor, but I could hear the quality of her silence, which had changed from the carefully guarded silence of the first week to something more open. Dureth told me that humans are reckless, she said, that you act without thinking, that it is a species-wide problem. Dureth left after 2 weeks, I said. I know. A small pause. I did not like him. Most people do not like people who describe them as problems. This time, the near laugh became an actual one, brief, quiet, a little surprised at itself, the way a laugh sounds when it has been unused for a while and finds itself happening anyway. I picked my book back up. She stayed in the doorframe a little longer. The word in our language, she said, for what you did tonight, going towards something dangerous without waiting, there is a word for it. What is the word? Vetharan, she said it carefully, the Vethari way, with the slight tonal rise at the end. It means unnecessary bravery. Is that an insult? It depends on who survives, she said. And then she went back inside, and the door closed. And I sat in the amber corridor light, and thought that Vetharan was probably the finest thing anyone had called me in a long time. 2 days later, at the morning shift change, I overheard one of the station security officers telling another that the princess had been seen sitting in the second chair outside her own room. Sitting, the first officer said, with the disbelief of someone reporting something they had not expected to see. For nearly an hour, said the second. A pause. With the human? Just near him. He was reading. She was looking at the gas giant through the corridor viewport. Another pause. Dureth was with her for 14 days, the first officer said. She never spoke to him. I know, said the second. They moved on. I was around the corner at the water station again, same as before. I filled my cup, walked back to my chair and sat down. The second chair was empty. Siro was in her room, probably sleeping. But the chair was no longer just a chair I had placed there. It was a chair that had been used. It had a purpose. That is a small thing. But small things accumulate, and accumulation is how trust is built, not in grand gestures, not in dramatic declarations, but in the quiet mathematics of showing up, and showing up, and showing up again. I opened my book. Outside the viewport at the end of the corridor, Vareth Sol turned its great amber face through the dark. Somewhere deeper in the station, in a part of the personnel records that I had not yet had reason to look at, a name was attached to the failed security protocols in docking sleeve 2, a name connected to someone who had authorized the maintenance uniforms, who had cleared the transit credentials, who had provided the corridor access window. I did not know that yet, but in 12 days I would find it, and what I found would change everything. The thing about a station full of beings from a dozen different species is that everyone assumes they are the only one paying close attention. The Vethari officers watched the corridors. The relay-borne navigators tracked the docking logs. The Chithari coalition members monitored communication channels with the careful patience of a species that communicated through layered signal bursts, and therefore had an instinctive distrust of anything that moved in a straight line. Nobody was watching the kitchen staff. I had learned this a long time ago, in a different part of the galaxy, in a posting that had nothing to do with princesses or gas giants. The people who bring food to a room know things about that room that the people inside it do not. They know who eats alone. They know who eats quickly because they are nervous. They know who sends food back untouched, and what that untouched food is, and whether it started happening before or after a particular event. They know the rhythms of a space the way a doctor knows a patient's pulse, not through analysis, but through daily contact. On Station 14, there were 7 kitchen staff. 2 were Vethari, 3 were of a species called the Morathi, who were roughly humanoid and communicated primarily through gesture and a secondary vocalization system that translated adequately, but never perfectly. 1 was a Chithari who had left the navigator caste for reasons I never asked about and did not pursue, and 1 was a human. Her name was Peg, short for Margaret, she told me on the second day, when I came for my morning cup. She was 61 years old, had worked on orbital stations for 30 years, and had opinions about everything, and the confidence to share them without invitation. She was the first person on the station who talked to me like a person, rather than a posting. You are the one guarding the Vethari girl, she said on that second morning. Yes, I said. The others were all officers, very formal. You do not look formal. I am formal when the situation requires it. She handed me my cup. Does the situation require it often? Not as often as people expect, I said. She studied me with the sharp, measuring look of a woman who had spent decades sizing up the people who passed through her kitchen. You will last longer than the others, she said, as if she was noting a fact about the weather. Then she handed me a second cup without being asked. For the chair, she said. I looked at her. She shrugged and turned back to her work. I stopped in Peg's kitchen every morning after that. We talked about very little. She complained about the station's supply delivery system, which was chronically late. I described the more absurd elements of coalition paperwork, which she found appropriately funny. I did not ask her anything professional. I did not treat the conversations as intelligence gathering. I just came for my coffee and stayed long enough to be a presence rather than a transaction. It was Peg who mentioned, on the 18th day, that one of the supply deliveries had been signed for by an officer she did not recognize. Is that unusual? I asked. Deliveries are always signed for by the same logistics officer, she said. Vethari, tall one, very thin, forearms even thinner than the other tall ones. Rethvan, I said. I had met Rethvan briefly in the first week. He ran supply intake for the station. Yes, except on the 14th. Rethvan was not here. Someone else signed. Different biometric, I noticed, because the handprint on the panel was the wrong color. She paused. Vethari bioluminescent signatures are light blue. This one was green-yellow. I looked at my cup. Green-yellow is which species? Morathi, or Chithari, on the lower frequency. She tilted her head. I did not think anything of it at the time, but then the day after was when your alarm went off. I was quiet for a moment. Peg, I said, you are very observant for someone who works in a kitchen. I work in a kitchen because I am very observant, she said. It is where the information is. I spent the next 4 days doing what Kolath and the security team were not doing, which was talking to people in the parts of the station that did not appear in the official security review. I talked to the technician who maintained the docking sleeve systems, a young Morathi man named Orev, who was deeply conscientious and vaguely terrified of making mistakes. I talked to the communications clerk who logged the transit credentials for all incoming vessels, a Chithari woman named Essa, who tracked signals the way some people track music, with a kind of absorbed pleasure that made her very good at her job. I talked to the 2 Vethari officers who managed the maintenance uniform allocations, separately and on different days, and listened very carefully to the slight differences in their answers. What I found was not a simple picture. The breach 11 days ago had not been a solo operation. It had required at least 4 separate acts of preparation: the transit credential clearance, the maintenance uniform assignment, the corridor access window, and the disabling of the secondary biometric scanner in docking sleeve 2. None of these actions was dramatic. None of them, individually, would have flagged a routine audit. Together, they formed a very deliberate architecture, and they had all been authorized, in different ways, through different systems, on different days, by the same level of clearance. Not the same person, the same level. Which meant either the operation was coordinated across multiple individuals with identical access, or one person had access to all 4 systems without appearing to. There was one position on Station 14 with that kind of access: the Advisory Council. Queen Velara of the Vethahari had a council of 5. 3 of them were based on the homeworld, 2 traveled with the station complement and handled the royal family's political and logistical arrangements aboard. I had not paid much attention to the Advisory Council before now, because my assignment was the princess, and the princess's daily life did not involve the Advisory Council much. But I pulled the access logs, not through official channels, which would have flagged my inquiry, but through a lower-level maintenance request that Essa helped me route, because Essa turned out to be the kind of person who did not ask why you needed something if your reason for needing it seemed sound. The logs showed what I expected and did not want to see. One of the council members, a Vethari named Adoveth, who had served on the Queen's advisory staff for 11 years and was considered by every formal assessment to be thoroughly reliable, had accessed the maintenance uniform allocation system on the 12th day of my posting, 3 days before the breach. He had accessed the corridor access scheduling system 2 days before that. He had not accessed the credential clearance system directly. But he sat on the oversight committee for the officer who had, and the override signature for that clearance carried a secondary authorization code that traced back through 2 layers of institutional structure to his desk. I sat with this information for a full day before I decided what to do with it. The correct thing, the by-the-book thing, was to bring it to Kalath. Kalath was the senior security officer. The chain of command was clear. The process was clear. But Kalath sat on the same oversight committee as Adovith. They had 4 years of professional history together. And more importantly, if I brought a formal accusation against a member of the Royal Advisory Council without absolute proof, not strong evidence, not compelling inference, but absolute proof, and I was wrong, or if the information moved through a compromised channel before it could be acted on, then the only outcome would be that Adovith would know he had been found. And if Adovith knew he had been found, the next attempt would not come through the docking sleeve. I thought about Len. I thought about the door we did not know about. I thought about the variable that had not been in the briefing. I went to Sehra. She was at the viewport when I knocked. Vera Thersh Sol was in its slow rotation, and the light coming through the glass was the deep orange of the gas giant's northern hemisphere, which was always more vivid than the south, and which turned everything in the room a warm, complicated color. "You have that expression," she said, not turning around. "What expression?" "The one where you are thinking about something you do not want to say." She paused. "I have been watching your face for 3 weeks. You have 3 expressions. The reading one, which is the most common. The corridor check one, which you do automatically and probably do not know you are doing, and the one you have right now." I was briefly caught off guard by this, which did not happen to me often. "You are right that I have something to say," I said, "and you are right that I do not want to say it, but I am going to, because I think you deserve to know." She turned from the viewport. The orange light caught the reflective layer in her eyes and made them look like lit amber stones. She was 17, and she had been through 14 months of relocation and grief, and the particular loneliness of being surrounded by people who were afraid of you. And she stood in that light, like someone who had decided a long time ago to be steady, even when everything around her was not. "Tell me," she said. I told her, all of it, the kitchen delivery log, the access records, the layered authorizations, Adovith's name. I watched her face as I spoke. She did not flinch. She did not look away. When I finished, she was quiet for a long time. "Adovith," she said. "He has been with my mother's counsel since I was 6 years old." "I know. He sent me a letter of concern when I was in the medical unit after the transit attack." "I know." She turned back to the viewport. Her hands, which had been at her sides, moved to the window frame and held it. "Why are you telling me?" she said, instead of Kalath. "Kalath has 4 years of professional history with Adovith. That does not mean he is involved. It means there is a channel for information to travel through that I cannot fully map. I do not know who I can trust in the formal security structure. I know I can trust you." She was quiet again. "That is interesting," she said, very softly. "Is it? Everyone else who has been assigned to me treats me as the person to be protected from information. You are the first person who has given it to me." I did not have a response to that felt adequate. "My mother arrives in 9 days," she said. "Yes. Adovith will know she is coming. He will know the station's security will be at full formal protocol for the arrival. There will be rotation changes, briefings, ceremony preparation. The attention will shift." She paused. "That is when he will try again." I looked at her. "Yes," I said. "I think so too." She turned from the window. She was calm in the way that people are calm when they are afraid, and have decided not to let the fear make their decisions. "What do you need?" she said. "I need you to tell me everything you know about how Adovith moves through this station. His patterns, his meetings, the people he speaks to. You have been watching this station for 3 months. You see things people do not think you see." She almost smiled. It was not a happy expression. It was the expression of someone recognized accurately for the first time in a long time. "I see a great deal," she said. We talked for 2 hours. She told me things about Adovith's movements that had not appeared in any formal record. The late-cycle meetings in the communications annex, the unusual frequency of his visits to the lower maintenance section, the way he had changed his meal timing since the breach. as if recalibrating his own rhythms. She told me about the officer he spent the most time with, a young Vethari lieutenant named Fereth, who worked logistics, and who had, in Sehra's observation, become noticeably more quiet in the last 3 weeks. Fereth, I wrote the name down in my head and did not forget it. When we finished, Sehra sat in the second chair, the one from the corridor that had come inside at some point without announcement. I was not sure exactly when. She sat in it and looked at her hands. "Are you afraid?" I asked. "Yes," she said, without hesitation. "Are you?" I thought about the honest answer. The honest answer was complicated. It was a specific kind of fear. Not fear of what might happen to me, but fear of the gap between what I intended to do and what I might actually be able to do. Fear of the door I might not know about. "I am afraid of failing," I said. "I am not afraid of the rest." She looked at me for a long time. "Vetheran," she said. "Unnecessary bravery," I said. "In this case, I think it might be necessary," she said. Across the station, in the communications annex on the lower level, a Vethiri officer named Adaveth was preparing for the arrival of his queen and the conclusion of an operation he had spent 14 months building. He did not know that a human sergeant and the princess he had tried twice to harm were sitting in a room above him, mapping his every move. And he did not know that a 61-year-old woman in a kitchen had noticed the color of a handprint. That was his mistake. He had planned for the obvious threats, he had not planned for the people nobody thought to watch. 9 days remained. The queen was coming, and I had work to do. 3 days before the queen arrived, I went to see Essa. I found her in the communications room during the mid-cycle quiet, when the signal traffic dropped and the room held only 2 operators instead of the usual 6. Essa was small for a Chithari, with the narrow shoulders and long fingers that her species used for the fine manipulation of signal arrays. She did not look up when I entered. She had a signal feed open on her panel, and was watching it with the absorbed focus of someone reading a very good sentence. I sat down in the chair beside her station and waited. "Sergeant Reeves," she said, without taking her eyes off the feed. "Essa," I said, "you found something. I need to route something quietly, the same way we did with the access logs." She finally looked at me, her secondary eyes, the translucent inner set that Chithari used for close-range detail work, were half open. "This is about Adoveth," she said. I studied her face. "You already knew." She was quiet for a moment. "I track signals," she said. "The ones that are meant to be tracked, and the ones that are not. There have been outbound bursts in the last 3 weeks that do not match any logged communication schedule. They are small, carefully timed to overlap with higher traffic windows. Someone who did not know what to look for would not find them. But you found them." "I find everything," she said, without arrogance, "just fact." "Can you tell me where they were going?" "I have been asking myself that since the first one," she said. "The answer is that they are going somewhere that does not want to be found, using a relay pattern that bounces through 5 intermediate points before the destination. I have 3 of the 5 points. The last 2 are not in any standard navigation registry." I looked at the signal feed on her panel. The data meant nothing to me in its raw form. I did not read Chitauri's signal notation, but the pattern on the screen had a regularity to it that felt intentional. "There is someone else involved," I said. "Not on this station. Someone receiving those signals and acting on them." "Yes," Essa said, "and they know the queen is coming. I believe one of those outbound bursts was a timing confirmation." I sat with this for a moment. "Essa," I said, "I need a favor that is outside any protocol I can point to." She looked at me steadily. "I need you to route a message for me through a channel that cannot be traced back to this station, to the Queen's direct security office. Not through standard coalition relay, directly." The secondary eyes closed slowly. She was thinking. Chitauri did their deepest thinking behind closed eyes, which I had learned not to interrupt. "It will take me 4 hours to build a clean relay," she said. "It will look like natural background signal scatter. The message will arrive intact." "Can you do it without anyone on this station knowing?" "I can do it without Adoveth knowing," she said, "which I assume is what you actually mean." "Yes." She turned back to her panel. "Write the message. I will handle the rest." I wrote it on a physical notepad, the old-fashioned kind that Peg kept in the kitchen for recipe notes, and that left no electronic record, and I was brief. I gave the Queen's security office the core evidence, the access log sequences, Adoveth's authorization trail, Farath's likely involvement, the outbound signal pattern, and the timing window I expected for the final attempt. I also gave them Essa's name and signal frequency, in case they needed a direct channel. I sealed the note in an envelope that was not really an envelope, but a folded piece of paper, closed with a small adhesive strip, which was the most secure communication method available to me in that moment, and I gave it to Essa, and she read it once, and then held it over a disposal unit until it was gone. "I will send the signal at hour 17, she said, "during the transit window. When docking sleeve 1 is processing the quarterly supply ship, the noise floor will be at its highest." I thanked her. "Sergeant," she said, as I reached the door. I turned. "I was the one who cleared the transit credentials," she said. "The ones used in the breach 11 days ago. I processed the clearance because it came through the standard authorization channel with all the correct secondary signatures. I did not flag it because I had no reason to flag it." She paused. "I have been thinking about that every day since." I looked at her. "You did not know," I said. "I should have found it." "You found everything else," I said. "You found the outbound signals nobody else would have seen. You found Adoveth when the entire formal security review missed him. One legitimate-looking credential clearance does not change any of that." She was quiet for a moment. "Go do your job, Essa," I said, "and let me do mine." I spent the remaining 3 days preparing for an attack I could not announce. I could not bring in extra personnel. That would signal to Adoveth that the net was tightening and accelerate whatever timeline he had. I could not change Sephra's room assignment, or add new locks, or move her to a different part of the station. Any deviation from established routine would be read and adapted to. I had to create the appearance of nothing changing while changing everything. I started with the room itself. The upper residential block had 2 service corridors, one primary, one emergency access. The emergency access corridor was narrow and poorly lit, and connected to the maintenance spine of the station's middle section. It was exactly the kind of path that a well-prepared infiltrator would use if they knew the station's layout well enough. Adoveth knew the station's layout well enough. I walked the emergency corridor 3 times at different hours of the day and night cycle, noting every junction, every storage rack, every point where the lighting dropped below useful. I memorized the distances. I memorized which panels were load-bearing and which ones were cosmetic. I found 2 places where the flooring had a different resonance, not hollow, just different, that would transmit footsteps in a way that uniform flooring would not. Then I talked to Sarah. Not in the way a guard briefs a protected person, in the way 2 people who have learned to trust each other talk about something serious. I told her that when the attempt came, not if, when, it would come through the emergency corridor. I told her she needed to move from her primary sleeping area to the secondary alcove inside the room, the one with the reinforced wall section, before hour 2 of the night cycle. Every night, starting immediately. Not as a response to any particular alarm, just as routine, just as habit. "Because if they are watching," she said, "they should not be able to tell which night is the real one." "Exactly," I said. She nodded once, already thinking, like someone who had accepted the reality of the situation and was focused on what came next. "And you?" she said. "I will be in the room," I said. She blinked. "You are always in the corridor." "That is what Adoveth has observed," I said. "That is what Farath has reported, assuming Farath is the inside contact. The guard is in the corridor, the room is empty except for the princess." I paused, "So I will be in the room. Behind the secondary panel near the interior door, there is exactly enough space." "You fit in a space that small?" "I spent 4 hours checking," I said. For the first time in our entire acquaintance, she actually laughed. A real one, full and briefly surprised, and she covered it with her hand, the way people do when a laugh catches them off guard in a serious moment. It made her look very young and very much more than the careful, closed-off person I had met on the first day. "I will need you to trust me completely on the night it happens," I said, when the laugh had passed, "and I cannot tell you in advance which night that will be, because I do not know." I know, she said. I have trusted you since the corridor. A pause. Since you came back. I will always come back, I said. It came out more direct than I intended. She looked at me for a moment. I know that too, she said. I also left a piece of evidence for Essa to give to the Queen's security office, a secondary piece, more specific, that would allow them to move on Ferrith before the night of the attempt, and thereby cut one of Adoveth's support lines. I asked Essa to time the delivery for the morning of the Queen's arrival, specific enough to be actionable, timed so that neither Ferrith nor Adoveth would have warning before things were already in motion. Essa said she would handle it. Peg gave me a wrapped piece of food for the night ahead. When I passed through the kitchen on the evening of the second day, she said nothing, just held it out. I took it. I did not ask how she knew. The night before the Queen's arrival, I waited. I was behind the secondary panel in Sekhra's room, in the small space between the panel and the load-bearing wall, which was indeed exactly large enough if I did not try to stand fully upright. Sekhra was in the secondary alcove, as we had practiced. The room looked from the corridor like an ordinary room. The chair was still in the hall. The second chair was inside, near the window. The station had settled into the middle of night cycle quiet that was as close to silence as a pressurized structure full of beings ever got. The air circulation system cycled softly. The lights in the corridor outside were at their nighttime level, low and amber, the old Vethari kind. At hour 1, nothing. At hour 2, nothing. At 2:30, I heard the emergency access corridor door open. The sound was very small. Whoever had opened it had done so carefully, with practice. But the floor near the junction had a different resonance, and I felt it through the wall before I heard it through the air. 2 distinct sets of footsteps. 4 individuals minimum, based on the pattern. They moved in a trained formation, the kind that comes from planning rather than improvisation. I let them reach the door. I let them begin to work on the secondary lock panel, which I had intentionally left on its standard setting, rather than engaging the additional lock, because an additional lock would tell a careful person that someone was expecting them. They got through the panel, the door opened. They came into a dark room with a sleeping alcove that appeared to hold a sleeping princess, and a guard who was supposed to be outside in the corridor. The sleeping alcove held a carefully arranged set of coverings over a long support cushion, which Sira and I had arranged that afternoon. Sira was in the reinforced alcove to the right. I stepped out from behind the secondary panel. What happened next was not elegant, and it was not quick, and it was, in the words of a training officer I once had, fundamentally unglamorous. 4 against 1, in a dark room, with the specific disadvantage that I needed to not damage the room itself because Sekhra was in it. I used the secondary panel as a barrier for the first exchange. I used the storage rack along the left wall for the second. I took a hit to the shoulder that I felt all the way down to my back teeth and kept moving, because stopping was not an option that served any useful purpose. By the time the lights came on, triggered by Sekhra from the reinforced alcove, which I had asked her to do after 90 seconds, regardless of what she heard, there were 4 figures on the floor, in various states of non-participation, and one very tired human standing in the middle of the room, breathing harder than he would have liked to admit. Sekhra stepped out of the alcove. She looked at the room, then at me. "You are bleeding," she said. "It is fine," I said. "Is it?" "It is not life-threatening," I amended. "That is not the same thing." "No," I said, "but it is the useful part." She looked at me for a long moment with those amber eyes, and there was something in them I did not have a name for, something that was not the careful guarded distance of the first week, or even the growing trust of the weeks after. It was something beyond that, something that looked a lot like what I imagine it looks like when a person decides, firmly and without doubt, that they are not going to be afraid anymore. The station's formal security response arrived 9 minutes later. Kalath stood in the doorway of the room and looked at the scene with the expression of someone doing a calculation they had not expected to have to do. His eyes moved from the 4 figures on the floor, to me, to Sekhra, standing untouched in the alcove, to me again. "Sergeant Reeves," he said. "Kalath," I said. "This is the second time," he said. "Yes," I said. "You were in the room." "Yes." You were supposed to be in the corridor. The corridor was where they expected me, I said, so I was not there. He looked at the 4 figures again. His arms moved through the calculation pattern. Then he looked at me one more time. Adovith has been detained, he said. As of 40 minutes ago, your information arrived with the Queen's Security Advance Team this morning. Ferrith has also been taken into custody. I nodded. You did not come to me with this, he said. No, I said. I am sorry about that. You did not trust me. I chose my words carefully. I did not know the shape of the information channels well enough to trust any of them. That was not a judgment about you personally. It was a limitation of what I could map. He held that for a moment. The calculation pattern in his arms slowed. The Queen arrives in 4 hours, he said. I know, I said. She is going to want to know what happened here. I imagine so, I said. Kalath looked at Sira for a moment. Sarah looked back at him, with the steady, unhurried gaze she had been practicing for 17 years, and had recently, it seemed, decided to actually use. You should get that shoulder seen to, Kalath said, to me. Yes, I said, in a little while. He left. The medical team came and went, and I sat with my back against the reinforced alcove wall, finally in a place where sitting down felt like the right answer, and waited for the morning to come. Sihara sat in the second chair, and did not sleep, and did not go back to the alcove. She stayed there while I stayed there, and Verithsal turned its long amber face through the dark outside the viewport, and the night finished itself out, and neither of us said very much at all. We did not need to. The Queen arrived at hour 7. I was in the corridor when the docking signal sounded. Clean, formal, 2 long tones followed by 3 short, which was the standard arrival sequence for a Vetharai royal vessel. The difference between this arrival and a standard docking was the way the rest of the station behaved. Every officer in the residential wing adjusted their posture. The lighting in the common areas shifted up by 15%. The air circulation, which had a particular staleness to it in the overnight hours, seemed to improve on principle. I had cleaned up as well as the circumstances allowed. The shoulder had been treated by the station medical team, wrapped firmly, functional if uncomfortable. My uniform was the best version of presentable I could manage, at hour 5 in the morning, after the night I had just had. I had combed my hair, which felt like the minimum viable effort and possibly insufficient. Peg had appeared at hour 6 with a pressed collar, from somewhere I chose not to investigate, and the firm instruction that I wear it. I wore it. Segra had retreated to her room to dress for the formal arrival, attended by 2 of the Queen's advance staff, who had come through in the earlier ship. I stood in the corridor and listened to the sounds of a station reconfiguring itself around the arrival of its most important visitor. I had been thinking, in the quiet hours before the Queen arrived, about what I would say when she asked me things. I had composed several versions of the answer to the question I expected first, which was, "Who are you, and why were you alone in that room?" The versions ranged from straightforward to absurdly detailed, and I had discarded all of them in favor of simply telling the truth, which is what I generally arrived at after wasting enough time on alternatives. The formal security review was scheduled for the 3rd hour after arrival. It was a Vethrai tradition I had been briefed on in the first week by Kalath, who had described it with the mixture of gravity and ceremony that the Vethrai brought to most formal processes. The sovereign asks an accounting of those responsible for the safety of the royal household. Each member of the protection detail reports their role and actions. The sovereign then formally acknowledges the protection given and releases the detail from standing duty until the next cycle. It was, essentially, a ritual debrief. I had been to versions of these before in coalition contexts. I knew how they worked. Stand, speak your role, sit down. I was not prepared for what this one looked like. The review chamber was on the upper deck of the station's central module, a large, well-lit space with high ceilings that I suspected had been designed by the oldest section's builders for exactly this kind of formal assembly. There were perhaps 60 beings present, officers from the station's security complement, members of the Royal Advance Staff, 2 members of the Advisory Council who had not been detained, several diplomatic observers from other species in the coalition. They arranged themselves in a wide arc, and I stood in the last row because I was not technically part of the formal detail and was attending as an affiliated protection officer. which was a designation that nobody had used before in this context, and that Kolath had created specifically that morning. The Queen arrived. Velara of the Vethari was not what I had expected from the briefing files, which had described her in the careful language of formal profiles: age, physical characteristics, political role, years of reign. What the files had not conveyed was the quality of her presence, which was the kind that does not require effort or announcement. She simply walked into the room, and the room reorganized itself around her, the way a stone dropped in water does not ask the water to move. She was tall, even by Vethari standards. 4 arms, carried with the complete control of someone who had grown up with that configuration and never thought about it as unusual. Her eyes were the same amber as Sephra's, but several shades deeper, the difference between early morning and midday light. She moved to the center of the ark with an unhurried certainty, and stood there, and looked at the assembled officers, and said nothing for a moment. The silence had weight. Then she spoke the first words of the review in Vetharari, which the translator units in the room rendered clearly. Who was charged with the safety of my daughter during the period of threat to this station? This was the expected question, the one every officer had been briefed on. The standard answer was for the senior security officer to step forward and give a formal accounting. Kolath was the senior security officer. He was standing 3 positions to my left. He did not step forward. Instead, he turned. I do not think I understood immediately what was happening. I thought at first he had turned to check something, or to address someone behind him, or perhaps there was a protocol element I had not been briefed on. But then the officer next to Kolath turned as well, and then the officer next to that one. And then, in the space of about 4 seconds, in a movement that was not rehearsed, and was not coordinated, and was the individual decision of 60 different beings, made at approximately the same moment, the entire assembled ark turned. They were all looking at me. Every officer, every member of the security complement, the advanced staff who had come in on the early ship, the 2 advisory council members who remained, the diplomatic observers who had no obligation to turn, and turned anyway. 60 beings, from more species than I had been able to count, all pointing, some with a gesture, some simply by the direction of their eyes, some in ways that were species-specific and that I could not fully interpret, but whose meaning was entirely clear, at one human, standing in the last row in a pressed collar that Peg had found from somewhere. I did not know what to do with my face. The Queen looked at me. She had the expression of someone confronting a significant surprise, managing it with the complete composure of someone who had been managing significant surprises for a very long time. She studied me with the thoroughness of a gaze that missed nothing and required considerable time to complete. A human, she said. Not a question, not an accusation, a statement, made in the way of someone identifying a thing they had not expected to see. Yes, Your Majesty, I said. She was quiet for a moment longer. When she spoke again, she set aside the formal structure of the review protocol. The rest of the room adjusted to this without visible surprise, which told me she did it often. How many of them were there, she said, when they came for my daughter? The first time, 2. The second time, 4. And you were alone both times? Yes. By choice? The first time, by circumstance. The second time, by choice. Explain the second. I explained it as simply as I could. I told her about mapping Adoveth's movements, the access logs, Essa's signal tracking, the construction of the evidence package that went to her security advance team. I told her about the positioning in the room, the decoy arrangement in the alcove, Sephra's role in triggering the lights. I told her about the floor resonance that told me they were coming before I heard them. She listened to all of it without interruption, which is a quality that is less common than it should be in people who hold power. When I finished, she said, "You did all of this without informing the station's senior security officer." Yes. Why? Because I did not know which communication channels were secure, and I did not have enough time to map them thoroughly, and the consequences of a wrong assumption were final. I paused. I am sorry for the breach of protocol. I would make the same choice again. She looked at me for a long time. I held her gaze because looking away seemed worse. "Sergeant Reeves," she said, "how long have you been on this station?" 31 days, And in 31 days, you identified a conspiracy that had been in preparation for 14 months, dismantled it without assistance, and ensured my daughter's safety through 2 separate attacks. She paused. Why did you stay? The others left. You were told the assignment was difficult. You had no particular attachment to this station, or to the Vethajari royal family when you arrived. I thought about the versions of the answer I had prepared. I thought about Len. I thought about the specific shape of my own reasons, which were not simple, and which I was not certain I could make simple. I settled for the honest version. I did not have anywhere better to be, I said, and then I did, or I could have. The assignment had given me enough to take something else, somewhere else, that would have been easier, and I still stayed. I paused. I stayed because the job was not finished, and because I found myself stopping, which I had not intended. Because, the Queen said. I looked at Sarah. She was standing at her mother's right, watching me, with the expression she had worn in the room the night before, the one I had not had a name for, the one that looked like the end of a long fear. Because the person I was protecting was worth staying for, I said. The room was very quiet. The Queen looked at her daughter for a moment. Something passed between them. A communication that had nothing to do with translation units, and everything to do with the particular understanding of 2 people who love each other, and have been afraid for each other, and are in the same room again at last. Then she looked back at me. In Vethari tradition, she said, a protector who serves through genuine peril, without personal obligation, who sees the protected as worth protecting, rather than a duty to be discharged, is given a name. She spoke a word in Vethari that my translator rendered with a slight delay, as if it was looking for the right equivalent and settling for a close one. One who remains, it said, the nearest human translation. I was quiet. It is the highest designation a non-Vethari has ever received, she said. It has been given twice in the last 400 years. Both times to Vethari officers who served in circumstances of comparable significance. She paused. I am giving it to you. I was aware of the room. I was aware of 60 beings watching. I was aware that the correct response was probably something formal and dignified and properly appreciative. Does it come with better quarters? I asked. A pause. A very quiet sound from Sephra's direction, quickly controlled. It does not, the Queen said, and something that was not quite a smile, but was adjacent to one, crossed her face. Then I accept gratefully, I said. The review concluded. The formal proceedings moved into their next stage, which involved the processing of a doveth and the full accounting of the conspiracy, which turned out to reach further than even my evidence had traced. 3 additional parties, 2 off-station, 1 political faction that had opposed the Queen's current policy position for years and had funded the operation through 5 layers of institutional distance. The Queen's security team handled it with the thoroughness of people who had been waiting for exactly this information and knew precisely what to do with it. I was not part of that process. My job was the princess. I went back to the corridor outside Sephra's room. The chair was where I had left it. I sat down. I found my book in the inside pocket of my jacket, where I had put it before the formal review, because it seemed like the kind of thing you did not leave in a room with 4 restrained individuals. I opened it to page 212, which was where I had last left off, and I read. The station settled into its evening cycle around me. The amber lights came up to their nighttime level. The air circulation shifted to the quieter overnight setting. Through the viewport at the end of the corridor, Vareth Sol made its slow, enormous turn. Somewhere behind me, at roughly the 90-minute mark, Sarah's door opened. I did not look up. I had learned not to, because looking up was the thing that made her hesitate, and not looking up was the thing that made her stay. I heard her step into the corridor. I heard the small sound of her sitting down in the second chair. I heard her settle, and then go quiet, in the way she had learned to go quiet over the weeks. Not the closed-off silence of the beginning, but the open kind, the comfortable kind. Outside the viewport, the gas giant moved. I read. She watched the stars. The hour went by, and then another. I was on page 231 when she spoke. Kaltal. Yes. What does the book end with? You have asked me that before, I said. You never answered. I turned the last few pages, the ones I had read 5.5 times, and looked at the final sentence. It is the kind of ending that does not try to resolve everything. Just the one thing that needed resolving. The man delivers the letter. The person who receives it, reads it, and does not say what it contained. The man walks back the way he came. The final line is only 7 words. It ends with him going home, I said. She was quiet for a moment. Does he have one? She said. A home. He does by the end, I said. He did not when he started. She considered this. Outside, Vareth Sol continued its passage through the dark, that great amber face reflecting the light of a star that was far enough away to look small even from here. The word Vitharan, she said. Unnecessary bravery. You told me that weeks ago. I told you the definition, she said. I did not tell you the rest of it. I lowered the book. There is a second part, she said. Most people do not know it, because it is Old Vetharari, pre-unification language. The full phrase is Vetharan Solan. It does not translate directly. The closest version in your language would be bravery that becomes necessary because of love. I held that for a moment. Sarah, I said. Yes. I am still your guard. I know, she said. I did not say anything else. Good, I said, because I have no intention of going anywhere. She almost laughed. I felt it rather than heard it, the adjustment of breath, the small shift in the quality of the air between us. I know that too, she said. I went back to my book. She went back to the stars. And I sat in that corridor, on a station orbiting a gas giant in a part of the galaxy that most humans never thought about, with a pressed collar peg had found from somewhere, and a book I had read 6 times, and a name in a language 400 years old that meant something that did not translate perfectly, but meant, approximately, one who remains. The name fit. I had never been good at leaving. The shift change came at hour 5, and the replacement officer nodded at me on the way in, and I stood up and stretched the parts of myself that had been sitting still too long, and I tucked my book under my arm, and I walked to the kitchen. Peg was already there, because Peg was always already there. She handed me a cup without a word. I drank it standing up, looking out the small kitchen viewport at the same gas giant from a different angle, amber and immense, and indifferent to the particular dramas of the organisms orbiting it. Well, Peg said finally. Well, I said. You are still here. Yes, I said. The other ones would have left by now, she said. The assignment is finished, technically. The Queen is on the station. Full formal detail takes over. You could request a transfer. I could, I said. She looked at me over her cup. 61 years of looking at people accurately. But you will not, she said. No, I said. I will not. She nodded, as if this confirmed something she had known for a while, but was glad to have confirmed. Sit down then, she said, and started making a second cup. I sat down. Outside, Vareth Sol turned. Somewhere above me, in a corridor I knew by heart, a second chair was waiting. I finished my coffee. I stood up. I went back upstairs. I sat down in the chair. I opened my book. And I stayed.